All right. Good evening and welcome, everyone. Welcome back to fractalu.com. I'm Dan Winter, fractalfield.com. And we're going to begin tonight with, we have just a few announcements, not too many. There is a change in the upcoming fractalu.com schedule. We're going to be adding a new lecture on May 7 from Valerie's wonderful friend, teaching about vision and the Bates method, actually. And that will be on May 7, and Patrick will actually follow on the 14th. In the coming weeks, next week is Practical Lifestyle for Bliss and Hygiene for Spiritual Lifestyle. The following week is the serious Star Trek Physics. And the following week is Down Memory Lane with Bucky, Bentoff, Puharich, Vogel, Arthur Young, Chris Bird, Tom Bearden, and many memories. And then we have Teresa Burns on April 23, teaching more about the hypercube from John Dee and the Ophena-Minochian and angelic science. So there's some fun stuff coming up here on fractalu.com. Do you have any announcements there, Tufan? How are we doing?
We're all good for time being.
Okay. All right. So tonight's conversation is specifically about the galactic history story. Now, we've done this many times, but there is a new little thread this evening in which we want to really bring the ET history story of Earth kind of up to the present. You know, when Anton Parks famously did his history of Enki, it doesn't really bring it up to the present. And Elena Danaan, of course, in her book Cedars, says Enki Thoth is back in the form of the 9. And we want to talk about that history. And again, bring that history up to the present, and particularly tell the ET galactic history in a way that has a moral to the story about what does this how does understanding the extraterrestrial history practically serve us in the present with the major dramas on the planet. We'd like to, in other words, context. And in that regard, to set the stage tonight, the subtitle of tonight's conversation is called Therapy for Graham Hancock. Now, why would we? First of all, we love Graham Hancock. You know, Apocalyptic History, Ancient Apocalypse series was a fabulous contribution. Graham Hancock is wonderful, but there is a certain drama there that is an example. He is saying that humanity has amnesia. We've lost our long-term history. And in the same time, so then he goes back to that history and wonderfully says almost every culture has a legend of a great flood. Wonderful. He says that's real, that's historical. The Lesser Dryad, the Greater Dryad, the Great Flood, when hundreds of meters tall flood circled the earth. And almost every culture on the planet talks about it. And then he says, after the Great Flood, there was this great hero. In every culture, there's a different name for that great hero: Oannes, Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, Zoroaster, Hermes, Thoth. Every culture goes back and says, well, this great hero came and saved the earth by reteaching humanity how to restart civilization. Well, that's cool. And he says, this is some wonderful, great mystery. And it is a wonderful, great mystery. But then he makes the statement for which I'm giving him the golden raspberry. And this is the statement he makes. But he says, and I'm saying it has nothing to do with ET. It's not about ET history. This is Graham Hancock. And so I'm saying Graham Hancock states the mystery beautifully. Like, there was a great flood and somebody came and saved humanity. Cool. Who was that? And then he refuses to look at the ET history. So I think he needs a little therapy in that it's obvious that the extraterrestrial history actually answers almost all the questions, if you understand that each of the great heroes of history that came to teach civilization is actually another name for Enki, Thoth, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, Hermes. These are basically all the same personalities if we understand our ET history. So, and in fact, how the Great Flood happened is a turning point in the ET history, which triggered the Lesser Dryad, which we now know is Tiamat, the great water planet, 4 times the size of Earth, was indirectly blown up in the conflict with the Federation, between the Federation and the Nebu Anunnaki, who were camped out on the earth, and they needed to be chased out of here. And there's so many sources that agree on this extraterrestrial civilization story that it's undeniable, it's compelling. And I'm saying that in this sense, for refusing to accept or even look at the extraterrestrial part of history, Graham Hancock himself is an example of the amnesia he accuses us of. And that's why we want to call this therapy for him. So now we go back in time and we look at the branches of that history. Now, as you may recall, now I'm going to start the screen share for this little lecture. This is the keynote called Ur-9, the Ur being the ancient Uru, the ancient Draco blood. And there are many sources to this ET history. For example, I knew Robert Morningsky, who we're going to talk about when he talks about the return of the nine. He calls it Peshmatan. So the Hopi story of ET history, they call Peshmatan. It's Hopi, 1 less than 10. And I knew Morningsky when he wrote that book from the Hopi ancestors, talking about the way of the nine, which became later the deep space nine. But the Hopi were talking about the way of the nine, and the Anunnaki hierarchy politically of their leadership was the number 1 through 9. And this then became the 9 of the Ennead of the Greeks and the Egyptians. They all had their 9. But why they were all called the 9, we're back to actually Elena Danaan, who says in her book, The Cedars, that the return of Enki, Thoth, now really called Ea, they call themselves the 9. And the plasma physics of that is central to our story. So the tellers of that story, and I knew Morningsky and the Hopi story quite well, include the, at that time, Pleiadian Tegotan version of this story, which our friend Med here, actually Tim, the interstellar mediator, and you can see these links from Tim, interstellar mediator, and the link to her site, all at the main website for tonight's conversation, which is fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood, as you know. And these are the beautiful PDF downloads of the history, ancient history of humanity, and the links are there at the Fusion of the Blood links. So now you notice there's a spot in here where in the table of contents, she's saying a brief history of Tiamat. And Tiamat was a planetoid about 4 times the size of Earth, mostly water. And when it blew up, that is the trigger. And many, many sources agree on this. And actually, Tufan is going to tell us more about those sources, that the fragmentation and breaking up of the planet Tiamat, which then became what is today the asteroid belt, most of which that planetoid was water at that time. And that water is what accreted around the earth and caused the great flood. And there's many, many sources on that. And so by ignoring the ET component of that history, Graham Hancock rather locked himself into a pretty small box. That's what we're saying. So now we need to know how and why that conflict arose. The first part of this lecture is going to be the story of the roots of the conflict that blew up Tiamat. The second part of this story is going to be the plasma physics of the 9. That's where we're going to go in the second part of this story. But right now we're going to stop the share. First part of the story. So as you know, I did about, 6 or 8 lectures with Elena Danaan, and we've worked closely together about the science behind these things, particularly about the science behind the 9. And Elena was very helpful at that time because she helped me understand the difference between what was called the Orion Wars, which is now, she clarified helpfully, the Orion Wars particularly referred to what we today call the Nebu and the Anunnaki, particularly the Nebu, which are the Greys and the Dracos, which controlled the central square cubic trapezium at the heart of Orion, which is the Stargate, most powerful one in this sector of the galaxy, over which the Orion Wars were essentially fought, because obviously whoever has the Stargate has the leverage. And recently, this is the part of the story that I really like. I have been predicting for, I don't know, 20 years of teaching the ET history. I have been saying that the humans on this little planet a long way from downtown, remember tens of thousands of humanoids, civilizations in this galactic sector alone. So we're a small kindergarten a long way from downtown, let's be clear. But the kindergarten is valuable because of the genetic diversity. And that genetic diversity here means our DNA is priceless if we can make a soul, which is what Enki's goal was. So I predicted that we could be the vaccine for the Orion Wars. And guess what? I was right. And here's how I was right. So recently, when the Galactic Federation related and descended from the ones who blew up Tiamat, the Galactic Federation now here, up in the present, managed to trap the three tall grays, the high level, we call them grays, Khmer, the Templars call them, who were most responsible for tricking Eisenhower and Truman into allowing millions of humans to be abducted by the grays at the Greada Treaty. The ones who did that trick after the Galactic Federation was in here booting out the Nebu, the grays and the Dracos, the Federation captured these three tall grays who were, really cooking up the messes where they were doing human organ sales and all kinds of crap under Dulce, for example. So they catch them, and normally the Gray's hive queen in that Orion heart trapezium will immediately disconnect the hive queen mind from the tall Grays as soon as she finds out they've been compromised. But they essentially put them to sleep before the hive queen could shut them out. And so later they were able to sneak in what you could call a virus, hint, vaccine, into the hive queen, the major queen for hundreds of Borg AI Gray civilizations around the Orion Heart Nebula, around that Stargate, which was controlled by the Nebu for what, I don't know, thousands of years by the Grays. And so the central hive queen of the Grays literally fell apart. Her hive mind disintegrated because we could think of it as a virus was planted there by the team from the Federation. Guess what? We were, in fact, the vaccine for the Orion Wars, because then the hive queen of the Grays in the Orion heart released all those civilizations who were under AI control. And so plus the major Stargate in the heart of Orion is now not in the hands of the bad guys so much. So, the vaccine for the Orion Wars story actually came true. But the point of this story is we want to set the stage for how and why this battle that about 12,000 years ago that caused the Tiamat flood, that was the flood of the Lesser Dryad, that then Enki and Thoth had to come back here and restart civilization. What is the context? What did Graham Hancock miss? And here it is. So, as I was saying, Elena helped me discriminate between the Orion Wars, which were over the Greys and the Nebu and the Anunnaki, versus when the Draco, whom are probably what we mean by Uru, and Uru Asa LM, Asa, queen of Uru, ancient Draco blood, when the Dracos blew up Lyra, the Lyran civilizations, and hundreds of humanoid civilizations did a diaspora all around the galaxy. And that was separate. That was different than what we call the Orion Wars. And Elena has sorted that very helpfully. The point was the history story that began the blowing up of Tiamat sets context for the situation on Earth at that time, and sets context for the history of Enki, which is central to Sitchin, central to Anton Parks, central to the returning of the 9 Enkis, really Ea. So the story of Enki is important. And remember, Anton Parks, we think, got that part right, that Enki remembers waking up in a cloning cooking pot in Pleiades, and his father's family, Anu and Enlil, were running for their lives from a female-dominated civilization in the Pleiades when they ran and hid in the solar system on Earth. And now we know they were right. The Taygatan Pleiadians, for example, are female-dominated. And we know that the culture that Enlil set up on this planet, Enlil later called Yahweh and the Jews, was dominated by fear of women. In fact, most religions on this planet were initiated out of fear of women. And learning where that fear of women came from was how I started needing to know. That is why I started studying the extraterrestrial history. So when the Anunnaki arrived here, remember, I think Elena is right, that the Anunnaki were essentially half a gray AI culture, bloodline cross with a humanoid reptilian culture. And that's what made Enki so interesting, because Anu, Enki's father, had Enki, his mother, Enki's mother, was human, whereas Enlil, the half brother, who was probably a clone, mother supposedly was reptilian, which we think is later related to what is called the Kingu, there were thousands of them under the South Pole, for example, and the Taygatan Pleiadians for many years. Their major activity on Earth was shooting the Kingus out from the South Pole, the reptilians, actually. But anyway, so when that Anunnaki culture arrived here, and Elena also sorted this out much more helpfully, that the Anunnaki ended up controlling planetoids and cultures quite a bit around this sector of the galaxy. This wasn't the only place Anu and his military family were controlling a civilization. This just happened to be one of the more high-value targets because of the genetic diversity here, which also explains why Enki found the original Takadama, Adam and Eve, so fascinating. In fact, so fascinating, he called them Adom, meaning the red man, because he had never seen iron-based blood. Their blood was chlorophyll-based green, and that molecule is so similar. And the iron in our blood gave us an increased potential for psychokinesis. The red man, the Takadama, Adom, red in Hebrew. And so Enki had a fascinating situation to practice his craft, which was basically genetic engineering and cloning, because Enki had an agenda. And that agenda was the ability to survive the encroachment of AI, artificial intelligence, civilizations all around the galaxy. And AI is a scourge still in our galaxy, for sure. And the only hope to escape from AI dominance was humans who could have a soul. Because what we call a soul is actually the longitudinal coherence that isn't just about enables you to lucid dream and take memory through death. That's the beginning. And remember our last video on the physics of what is a soul with Sasha Stone. That video went viral, 30,000 views. People are getting it. What it is to have a soul is predictable, it's measurable, it's real. It's when the DNA braid implodes, physics of bliss, for example, and that compression triggers the release of coherent longitudinal electromagnetic fields, sometimes they call the Ba from the Ka, the rainbow light body. We've talked about this many times. And so Enki's cookbook, the reason he was doing the experiment, and now he says he's bringing back the full genetic recipe, he calls it the Adam Kadmon. It's basically another name for the Grail. And that cookbook for DNA that can make a soul, which is literally implode, that is the story to this whole Maury. I mean, it's the reason we're talking about this. If you could teach your kids to make a soul, that's why his science officer, Hermes Thoth Trismegistus, his symbol, caduceus, is today called implosive phase conjugation, because that is the physics of life itself. And that was their agenda, to cook up a genetic material whose ensoulment could steer tornadoes at a distance and ultimately beat the Borg. And so there's the potential happily ever after. So anywho, now we're setting the stage for the war that took out Tiamat. So now the Anunnaki, Enki and Enlil, are here. Remember, they had to nuke their way into the solar system because they had no more clever way of getting through the Van Allen belts than using their nukes. And the Syrian design tech called the Ark of the Covenant, which is a capacitor, which is implosive, which measurably reduces radioactivity because implosive capacitors do. And so the Ark was where they stuck their nukes. And so, but this contained a trick, you see. This contained a clue to what became what's called the quarantine, because the Federation knew that the Anunnaki at that time, not later, but at that time, they were stuck with their craft, that to get through the Van Allen belts, they needed their nukes. So what the Federation did at that time was really quite clever. They all right, so they see the Anunnaki, which are half gray, half humanoid, and later the grays and the Kingu were, trying to basically steal the genetic treasure of Earth from the humanoids of the Galactic Federation. So they eventually got to get in here and do something about it. So they brought their fleet, I mean their battle fleet, over here. And this is 12,000 years ago, and there are multiple sources on this. And they say we got to blast these bastards out of here, basically. And the nuclear, and it was nuclear battle that followed. Remember, there's nuclear molten glass all over the Sinai. There's all kinds of proof of this. This was a nuclear war. There's no question. This ain't new. They know it's bad news. That's why they're trying to prevent us now. So sure enough, they made a mess and they lost. I mean, the Federation basically, they did not succeed. And meantime, the nuclear blast, and Tufan's going to talk a little bit about this, how is it the electric universe people and plasma universe people, right, Tufan?
Yeah, that's the electric universe people.
Yes. So they're and Tufan's going to review these sources in a minute, but just to say that many sources agree that at one point, probably 12,000 years ago, many of the planets in the solar system got banged around like they were ping pong balls. Oops. So the nuclear blast blew the atmosphere off of Mars. That's a tragedy. And that is what the movie Total Recall is about, quite literally. And they didn't hit Tiamat directly, but Tiamat, 4 times the size of Earth, was not very stable, and it was mostly water. And it began to shake, vibrate, and pretty soon it just disintegrated. And that distributed water around the solar system. The remains of Tiamat, we believe, are the asteroid belt now, and Tufan's going to talk about those sources. And the water hit Earth, the great flood of the Lesser Dryad. And so we're going to review some multiple sources on that, but I want to say one more thing about it first. When I said, oh, the Federation was a little clever about this. So now the solar system is quivering badly. All kinds of planets are falling out of orbit, and the thing's a mess. I mean, it's a mess. And at that time, and there are many sources on this, the Earth did not have a moon. 12,000 years ago. No, there was no moon here. Hello. What did they do? The Andromedans, particularly, it was Andromedan Pleiadians. The Federation is much bigger now, but it was still Andromedans and Pleiadians who were involved at that point. They're famous for this. In fact, I don't think David Wilcock knows it, but that's why they were called the Blue Sphere Alliance. Actually, the Blue Spheres that's Andromedan planetoids, engineered, hollowed out planetoids. That's the specialty of the Andromedans, actually. So they towed one of them in here. It was kind of a broken down old Cadillac. It wasn't. This was not a new Cadillac. No, the hollow metal artificial moon towed in here at that time originally was from an Andromedan source, and the fact that the moon fits the cone between the Earth and the moon is obviously engineered. There's no explanation. And the fact that when the Apollo craft smashed down on the moon and it rang hollow like a bell for days. I mean, could that be a clue that it's metal and hollow? Hello. Anywho, so what they did was they stuck these nuclear-powered ancient infrasound EMF resonators in the moon, which we'd call the frequency fence or quarantine. And their primary design was to increase the amplitude of the Van Allen belts, which at that time was effectively a trap for particularly the Anunnaki, who were too klutzy as navigators to get anywhere without nuking their way through. So that temporarily trapped them in. But it wasn't a long-term plan. It wasn't a good plan. It was just a temporary solution to try to trap the bad guys in here. Now, it's not just Med and the Pleiadian Tegatans who tell this story. There's versions of the story virtually the same in the Andromedan culture, the Pleiadian culture, and there's even shadows of this in the Hopi culture. This is not a new story. So anyway, much later, of course, the Anunnaki found new ways to make the gold powder, and they were eating it and getting a kind of artificial immortality from that. And Sitchin did get one thing right, which was the gold could be used to restore atmosphere, in the sense that if you plant the gold on the magnetic line crosses on a planet, you can temporarily stabilize the charge implosion named gravity and thus stabilize atmosphere, because obviously gold nano is a phase conjugator, and that's how you stabilize gravity. So anywho, and Anton Parks really did, I think was very correct when he said Sitchin screwed up so many of the translations, you just can't depend on him. Anton Parks, I think, did a much better job. But I am here to tell you, and I am here to challenge Anton Parks to bring his beautiful Enki history up to the present and say, oh, what about Enki came back? Are you ignoring that, Anton Parks? Hello, he's back in this the craft, which is related to what was called Nibiru, which is a giant planetoid. Enki came back in, his real name's Ea, for whom Earth was named, and he's back in there he's back in the solar system with a group called the Nine, and we're about to find out what that means. And Elena calls them the Cedar races, and he's got an agenda. And his agenda is not about creating some kind of hero worship out of the Enki myth. That idea bores the hell out of him. No, it's about returning what would be called the Adam Kadmon, which is the ancient recipe for DNA that can implode and make a soul. That is the heart of the Grail myth. It points out the tremendous error in biophysicists who talk about something called junk DNA, and they're fools because they do not know that these spacers are required to program the points at which, when DNA recursively braid, it can implode and make a longitudinal wave coherently, which is the physics of a soul. So anybody who doesn't know what a soul is electrically ain't allowed to do DNA changes. And so the Adam Kadmon is this Grail recipe with Enki the Nine brings back to them, which is all about the physics of plasma. Now, in order to give some correlation to these history stories about when there was this great flood, we have asked Tufan to review a couple other sources that confirm that there was a great flood and that it did have to do with the extraterrestrial history and the blowing up of the planet Tiamat, and how this is a reconfirmation of that we now know where the flood came from, that there are multiple sources. Okay, Tufan. I'm going to unpin myself.
Sure. Dan, would you like to put the plasma shadows image so that we can go over those while I'm speaking?
Oh, that's a good idea. Okay, here we come. So now is that the one you wanted? So
petroglyphs.
Okay. So let's let's get this. Yes. So this is from goldenmean.info/whale dreamers, where we talk about the plasma history, and we talk about the fact that Los Alamos and Tony Peratt, working with my friend John McGovern, published that 9 plasma donuts, in fact, do self-organize and make a living body. Hint, the 9. And then they published these plasma stickman diagrams that Tufan is about to speak about, that the plasma stickmen actually tell you at what latitude the shaman is looking at interstellar plasma storms and prove this history of the Earth. And Tufan is going to talk about these. So these are the pictures. So Tufan, which one would you like first? Sorry.
Start with number 3. And
okay. Yeah. Okay. Turn your mic on. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm going to mute my.
So yeah, in order to understand these pictures and petroglyphs, I believe we will need to briefly go over the electric universe theory, which suggests that electric currents flowing through space can generate magnetic fields and plays a fundamental role in the behavior of galaxies, stars, planets, and other celestial bodies. Now, one of the key tenets of the electric universe theory is the idea of plasma cosmology, and many observed phenomena can be explained by the interactions between plasma and electromagnetic fields. Many researchers and physicists like Immanuel Velikovsky suggested that planet Earth has suffered natural catastrophes on a global scale, both before and during humankind's recorded history. For instance, the memory of a flood or deluge, Noah's flood, is recorded in the Hebrew Bible, in the Greek legend of Deucalion, and in the Manu legend of India, and many more. So the causes of these natural catastrophes were close encounters between the Earth and other bodies within the solar system, the planets Saturn, Jupiter, Venus, and Mars. These bodies having moved upon different orbits within human memory. Specifically, the petroglyphs, if you can go back to the petroglyphs picture, the petroglyphs called the stickman would be the shadows of plasma field interactions caused by the alignments of these planets when the solar system had a different order before the major catastrophe, which may very well be traced back to the destruction of the Tiamat, the ocean planet, which became the asteroid belt now.
So, let's see. So the idea is that the shaman who drew that stickman was seeing that central cross-section of a donut from a certain latitude, and you can tell at what latitude the shaman was seeing the plasma shadow between planets by how high or low those two dots were around his belly. That actually,
picture number 5 would indicate that.
Oh, thank you. Picture. Yes. So the relative perspective angle that they were seeing these arcs. So the shaman, when he's carving this on a cave wall, is clairvoyant, and he's seeing the interstellar plasma, which indicates the relationship between the local plasma, the local planets. And so what the plasma universe and electric universe people are saying is that they can actually know that the distance, for example, of Jupiter, Mars, Saturn was radically different at that time. Just click it off if you would, Valerie. Sorry. So the plasma universe study is another way to document that the history of the planets in the solar system suffered a great catastrophe. Could you turn that one off? We got too many gadgets beeping here. Sorry about that. It's like Grand Central Station over here. So the other point to be made about this is that when we talk about great ancient beings like Shiva, they're often depicted as, in fact, inhabiting a plasma storm. The great beings, plasma gods, were, in fact, beings who are centripetal enough in their aura to inhabit interstellar plasma storms. We know a shaman can steer a tornado now. We know the physics. If you watch a shaman steering a tornado, you see the plasma from his solar plexus embed in the tornado, and you can see physically how he becomes the center of gravity of a tornado. Well, if your aura is big enough, hello, you can steer very big tornadoes. And that's where we got to grow up to come. In fact, every ancient religion, any scholar can tell you that every ancient religion on this planet is basically a sun god religion. Now, Anu, Enki's father, called himself Anu, meaning sun god, not because he succeeded, no, but because he was a wannabe. The same reason that Enlil called himself Yahweh. Yahweh is a name for 2 light cones, and he was a wannabe. The point is, though, that if you ain't a sun god, you ain't nobody. I mean, if your aura is not big enough to inhabit a star, you're boring. So that's why every ancient religion was a sun god. And that's why Osiris, if Osiris didn't, his aura didn't inhabit the sun, the Nile wouldn't flood on a time. That is physics, kids, centripetal force. Anyway, so I'm just pointing out that the Hopi had a name for this, the Way of the Nine. The Way of the Nine is actually a plasma domain science. So, and that's why there's 9 roofs on the pagoda, and why there's 9 layers in Dante's Inferno, and it goes on. So these are the lectures I did about this physics, including the 2 here about the 9 that I did for Elena Denon, which went somewhat viral. There's probably close to 250,000 views on all those films, and there's 2 to 3 million views on our YouTube channel. So if you animate the path which allows DNA to implode, do you see the myth of the Grail? This is why Enki came back with the Grail story. And Enki's, this is where the story really has to, this is where we're starting our therapy for Graham Hancock right here, right now. This is called therapy for Graham Hancock. So Enki's other name was Thoth. And Thoth is also the name of the line of kings of Egypt. Thothmosis literally means sons of Thoth. And Vincent Bridges was such a stubborn kid. He always says, well, Thoth is just a myth. And so he needs as much therapy as Graham Hancock, because actually Thoth is very real, and he's back. And he's been doing his homework. His other name was Viracocha Quetzalcoatl, and all the heroes of Graham Hancock's stories that he missed the ending for. Oops. And the other point about Thoth is, Lawrence Gardner did get that right. Thoth was named Tahuti, and that was called DWD. I'm sorry, TWT in ancient Hebrew, Tuti. And then they changed the abbreviation to DWD, which means the line of David. So everywhere in Hebrew, where they say the line of David, they mean the bloodline of Thoth. And everywhere they say the line of the Egyptian kings is Thothmosis, they mean the bloodline of Thoth. And everywhere they say South America on the South Pole is named Thule, and then the North Pole is named Thule, they mean the place of Thoth. And when they say Atlantis was named Thule, what do they mean? So the story goes, and then it even gets more colorful. Then we come to find out that the Jesus story starts when the royalty of Egypt, hint, Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, when Akhenaten, screwed up the banking and had to run for his life and changed his name to Moses and became a gold powder cook, the Akhenaten's son, Tutankhamun, became 90% of the Essene story is the royal family of Egypt. And guess what that means, kids? That means the Essene descendants, the Magdalene story. If you talk to the Templars, the lead Templars, they all say the Black Madonna is the daughter of Thoth, every single one of them. So what does that tell you about what's today called the Grail bloodline? Hint, Da Vinci Code. It's literally the bloodline of Thoth. Well, what was that designed to do? That was designed to plant the seeds of the Grail, which is the physics of how to make a soul and DNA. Do you know how to make a kid that can have a soul? Hello, that was the agenda. Anyway, so this is from the website on the fusion in the blood. You see, the one family, the Anunnaki family, Sumerian, the father was called Anu, but he was actually called Apollo or An or Darth Vader, depends which myth you're looking at. And Enki was called Merku in Secret Places of the Lion. He's the father, well, he's the Thoth Hermes, but he was also called Ptah and Atun and Poseidon and Zoroaster. And when we got to the South Africa, Credo Mutwat said his name was Kiliman, as in Kilimanjaro. So he gets around, right? And he was also called Lucifer, by the way. And he was called Baal, as in Beelzebub, or Bo, as in Bohemian. He was called Loki, and he was called Oannes. So almost all of the heroes of Graham Hancock's story, every single one of those missing heroes is another name for Thoth Hermes. That's why I'm calling this presentation Therapy for Graham Hancock. Because, you will have amnesia if you refuse to recognize extraterrestrial history. That's our point. So we want and he was called Fish God, and also he was called Luke Skywalker, whereas Enlil was called Yahweh and Jehovah. And that in Egypt is what was called the Atun, Enki, versus the Amun, Enlil priesthood. And the Amun priesthood, when Tutankhamun changed his name to Tutankhamun, they changed their name based on who was winning the war that year, Enki or Enlil. And Enlil, Yahweh, they were Amun, they were the bankers. And the bankers are the one who kicked Akhenaten out of town because he bankrupted Egypt. And that's when he changed his name to Moses. And that's the origin of the Essenes. And they were gold powder cooks. The Essene made piles of money by selling gold powder all around the world. And how did they do it? The Ark of the Covenant was a phase conjugate arc, which could stabilize gold nano in its monoatomic state and make it edible. Mana, Ormes, the spice. May the spice be with you. So you see, as we get more and more pieces of the ET story in understanding, we can come to graduate from our amnesia and learn the story to the Mori. I'm not saying the ET story itself is redemptive. No. I'm saying the physics behind it is redemptive. Remember, you can wake up from the nightmare called history only after you learn the science lesson. And history is a nightmare. So anyway, these are the 9 steps of Dante's Inferno and the story of the 9 and the pagoda. And interestingly, this also then applies to the physics of the Sri Yantra here in the movie Last Mimsy. Note the 9 golden ratio tetrahedron in 3D. And this is the plasma physics the kids in Last Mimsy saw in the sky. It was a braiding algorithm for imploding the 9. And this is the actual 9 golden ratio tetrahedron shadows, which indicate the implosive braiding algorithm of the rotating tetracube, which casts the shadow here, which when it goes from a tetracube ratchet, Sri Yantra on the right, to a pentadodeca ratchet called DNA on the left, that is the difference between what makes a soul. That is, it's the implosion of that recursive braid that spits out the longitudinal coherence that enables lucid dreaming and memory through death. And this was our previous lectures on the physics of how DNA makes a soul. It's that when the phonon wave, low frequencies here we're measuring heart coherence, top left, and we're measuring the effect on DNA braiding, center top, the presence of the enzyme responsible for the braid. Glenn Ryan did this study at my suggestion. And so we proved by measurement here that when you feel love, bliss, your DNA braid ratchet goes, and the slinky tightens. That's implosion. And that braid, so it's a length, area, and volume connected by golden ratio. And so that braiding does this, the short wave then braids in the long wave. So the short wave becomes part of a longer wave envelope. And the answer lies folded in that envelope, in the DNA braiding, in the sense that that implosion then spits out that longitudinal coherence. So that's why this is what you see at the moment of death right here, lattice cobweb tunnel spiral, the Heinrich Kluwe form constants, the map to death, successful death. You remember your memory passes before you in a second as you're dying, because you must compress in order to enter the longitudinal array called ancestor memory. It's how you save the ghost, because you have to enter that array, you have to undergo compression and then distribution. So as Ray Moody successfully showed, successful death is an electrical black hole. And that's why the death visions are electrically contagious. And so the reason you see lattice cobweb tunnel spiral, the Heinrich Kluwe form constant at the moment of death, is right here. This is the recursive braid geometry, which allows DNA to implode, and that is what allows you to compress and implode your transverse EMF into the longitudinal coherence called the rainbow light body, the Ba from the Ka, the soul. And so successful death is that compression, and that actually is that recursive braiding algorithm. That's why it looks like the Grail. This is why the Grail is the name for Enki Thoth's agenda, happens to be the geometry of the Grail legend in the Magdalene story, Migdal, 2 tower, a cup within a cup. And you've all seen these animations. So you can zoom in forever. And this is literally the only possible 3-dimensional fractal, which is the same as the Star Mother kit, a dodeca and dodeca. And it is romantic, and it is a Valentine, and it is implosion. So this bloodline called An-Ag-Ur, the story of the history of the Ur, the Uru, Ibi Uru. I was there when Morning Sky, he said, when I discovered the physics of the origin of the Hebrew alphabet, he says, oh, no, now I know why they call them Ibi Uru, Hebrew. The Uru essentially means ancient dragon blood here, and Ibi means the bird tribe. And the Hebrews say the word Hebrew means crossing over. But what was crossed over was the bloodline from Ibi to Uru. And for the dragon blood, reptilian brainstem, to feed the bird brain, Ibi, a Kundalini is required, and the index to that symmetry sequence, and you've all seen my animations of the physics of the origin of Hebrew. You just take the spiral on the donut and use the tetra to index the shadows, and you've got Hebrew. It's a cookbook for nesting donuts, which is how you'd make, for example, an atomic table. So these are just more the visuals we used for the original ET history. But here's what we were talking about on the top left. So when recently the Nebu Greys were not just ejected from the solar system, but their central hive queen in the heart of Orion, the biggest stargate in this galactic sector, got booted. The vaccine for the Orion Wars worked. This is what the trapezium was. It's a cube. And that cube is the most massive stargate in this galactic sector. That's why the battle was over the stargate. And it was controlled previously by the Nebus, the Greys and Dracos, as Elena appropriately calls them. Tufan, was there something else that you were supposed to put here?
Maybe we can answer some questions.
Good. I'm going to mute.
All right. So Astro asks, if you can comment on the snake, Naga, and Eagle. Are they Dracos, and who are the Eagles?
Okay, Pin. That's a useful question. So remember, there are many levels to that question, obviously, but the reptilian brain stem, the back brain dominance that allows fast response time, called in the flow, the name of the mouth of the reptilian brain stem, the snake in this sense, which is how Quetzalcoatl Viracocha got their name when the serpent feeds the eagle. There are many levels of metaphor, but probably the most powerful one is in the physics of Kundalini, where you get the horns, which identify Moses and Lucifer, who's really Enki, for example, that the ventricle horns crystallize and the cones become extended, and you can measure the actual ringing of the ventricle liquids in the brain during Kundalini. And that's all at goldenmean.info/Kundalini. So here is the snake brain feeding the bird brain. The mouth of the snake brain, amygdala, meaning the mouth, migdal, to tower. And it is. The spine liquid pump causes the spine to tower. Actually, is why the migdal tower, migdal means to tower. And so the phonon wave, which is the sacrocranial physics of Kundalini, pumps the microwave and ultraviolet component of the even the sexual juices up the spine liquid, and it comes through the amygdala, the mouth of the snake brain, and feeds the bird brain, whose wings are the crystallizing ventricle liquid horns. You get horny when you conserve the sexual juices. That's a phonon compression wave that's crystallizing the more liquid ventricle liquids. So the serpent is feeding the eagle. And that is perhaps one of the most useful levels of the metaphor of the snake and the bird. And you see these pictures of the snake holding the mouth of the bird, the eagle, holding the mouth of the snake in its talons. And literally the bird brain has to hold the mouth of the snake brain absolutely still and milk the sanchidam. You could call it testosterone poison, you could call it, but it's actually the high frequency nutrients of the spine liquid pump delivering a sweet nectar that drips down on the base of the back of the tongue. I carry on about Kundalini because I've been teaching the physics for 30 years. goldenmean.info/Kundalini. But you see that the center of that myth then is the descriptor for the guy in the doorway at Rennes-le-Chateau with the horns, Lucifer, look, light eye the fire. Remember the name Lucifer for Enki and Saddam, Set territorial administrator, which became Satan, the name for Enlil. They took turns calling each other the devil, depending on who was winning the public relations war that year. But neither one cares about the personality worship. No, the only thing that matters is actually the physics behind it, which is you don't get to look's eye the fire like Lucifer to light the fire unless you can implode that biophysics inside, and that gives you leverage over very big tornadoes. So that's why the serpent has to feed the eagle, and that's central to the story of Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, which are other names for basically Hermes, who taught this physics.
Okay, thank you. There's another one from Ellen. Is Enki Hermes our God? When we die, do we become his angels?
Yeah, Enki is very concerned. He does not wish us to call him God. Hell no. No, that's boring. No, he wants us to learn how go forth and sin no more. You too can become. That's the point here. No, he wants us to learn the science of how our auras could inhabit very large tornadoes and ultimately stars. That's when we can grow up, and that's when we get interesting. And it has nothing to do with personality worship, miracle worship, God worship. It's all crap. Sorry. No, the only thing that matters is if you got a big aura, and that is science. It's hygiene. Religion was useful for a few hundred years here, but it became obsolete at the point where we could understand enough science to be empowered and make decisions for ourselves. So no God wants to be worshipped. You can embed in a very large plasma field, like the relationship between a guru and a disciple, and the guru shields you in their aura and their plasma field, and that's okay for a while. It's kind of like kindergarten. It's not evil, it's just childish. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, another one from Ajda. What do you think about Dolores Cannon and her information that she claimed she was getting from ETs herself? A lot of her QHHT work is beyond amazing and really resonates, but when she later started speaking about ETs as being all benevolent, it raises the doubt. Is it possible that she was influenced by the Grays?
Yeah, this is a metaphor here because the Grays are very, very tricky. The Nebu, they come in here with their story. Oh, we're yourself in the future. We're saving you in the future. This is crap. And this guy Tim, who's teaching on Gaia TV, the Grays are about his only teacher. That's bad news. But now Dolores Cannon, we spent lovely time with in Perth, and Valerie found her very inspiring and really studied her stories and work and her techniques of hypnosis now to take people back to these memories. I'm sure it's very powerful and useful. We think Therify, for example, can help people go into those trances. On the other hand, like Steiner, Dolores was pretty stuck in the Christian metaphor, and I do mean stuck. And, so too many people think they were Magdalene. Oh, well, so you know, there were limitations, and a big limitation, obviously, is there wasn't much physics there. But her technique of retrieving memories with hypnosis and then comparing them seems very, very useful to me. And Valerie was very, very impressed and still loves that work. So obviously they all have limitations, but still, you know, a beautiful story.
Amir has a question regarding Orion and named Kaaba. Is there any similarity or relevance with the Kaaba in Mecca, Saudi Arabia? And why the pyramids point to Orion?
Well, thank you for asking one of my favorite questions. But first, the pyramids point to Orion because that is the biggest stargate around here. So if you want transport, hello, it ain't a mystery. It ain't rocket science. If you want to use the big stargate, you got to project your plasma there. Hello. No, but as far as the Kaaba stone is concerned, and this is, remember, the Kaaba stone was called Lucifer's eye. Lucifer is another name for Enki. So ain't that the good guys? Well, the Kaaba stone is a very particular kind of meteorite called a glass meteorite. And in a glass meteorite, the only thing that survives the heat of reentry is the vapor nanobubbles of the platinum group metals, gold, palladium, platinum. And so the nanobubble, think of it as gold nanobubbles, percolating through the glass meteorite of the Kaaba stone, made the perfect phase conjugate dielectric. Hint, philosopher's stone projective powder, the red powder John Dee used, actually Kelly used, and by the way, Flamel used the same stuff, and we think it was the same guy, Vincent, really. But anyway, so the Kaaba stone was inherently pricelessly valuable for the quality of phase conjugate dielectric. Remember, the Ohio Serpent Mounds were valuable because the meteor left the right stuff there. The rose star map of Prague makes it irresistible because the meteor left the right stuff there. So the meteoritic, Tutankhamun's famous sword was priceless because it had the right metal from a meteorite. Hello, what's the magic? The magic is that you get these particular kind of implosive capacitance from phase conjugate dielectrics, which is called the philosopher's stone projective powder, the key to alchemy. And it's the key to alchemy because a little bit of that red powder, Kelly put it correctly, in the mercury at the right temperature, you get a phonon wave, and you get the isotope transition, which is only one electron actually, between mercury and gold, for example. And that's the physics of alchemy, non-destructive charge collapse. It's the only physics of alchemy is isotope transition catalyzed by critical temperature, critical pressure, and permissive capacitive charge distribution enabling isotope transition. Hint, the powder they ground up from the Kaaba stone, later called the philosopher's stone. Well, the guy called the Mad Caliph, who sold half of its volume in history, went mad because he ate it, the powder, as most of the alchemists do, because it's legend that you'll get immortal. Well, there's a minor detail. Well, there's several minor details here, but one of which is the Kaaba stone was massively infected with the black goo, which the Draco were using for, hello, this is a messy story. Actually, the royal Draco called Siakar do not get infected by the black goo, but the rest of the Draco normally do. And both Harold Kautzvilla and Johann Fritz accurately tell the story of the history of the black goo and the Kaaba stone. But for example, those who do get infected typically do what all black goo was designed to do, which is turn every planet into a desert. So if you read about how patriarchal religions create desert, this is science, this is physics, this is desertification and patriarchy by James DeMeo. It's a very good science, how patriarchy causes the spread of deserts. It's literally failure to touch, which is the only way water vapor can become a droplet. And so the disease spread, which is patriarchy, anger, and desertification by the black goo, is just the beginning of the problem, actually. And that's another deep and messy story. But just suffice it to say that the the centerpiece of most of the religions on this planet. And we're not going to pick on just the Muslims here. We're going to pick on all religions equally. We're saying Enlil was the largest plasma parasite in history. We're saying when the Jesus story turned into the Roman Catholic Church and hundreds, maybe thousands of millions died because of the spread of the Catholic Church, which is a giant parasite. So no, we're not criticizing any religion. We're criticizing all religions. Thank you very much. Next question.
Okay, then Amir has a follow-up question regarding gold and magnetic fields, specifically the Kaaba in Mecca. Has this been measured, and what is your understanding regarding mitochondria iron atom shifting when pointing towards Kaaba, or entering an MRI machine that shifts the iron atom cause us to have more energy increasing our aura field for better implosion?
Well, it's correct. The magic of implosion in the mitochondria is transformative, absolutely. And it's true. The direction, for example, that the Muslims circulate around the Kaaba stone is profoundly indicative of the need to enter a centripetal field. Even the Sufis knew the direction to turn. And the physics of time travel is instructed in some universities using Sufi turning. Hello. And it is the orientation of the iron, because iron blood, the red blood, is the key to the psychokinesis of the human race in general, Adam Kadmon. So there's a lot of very important metaphors there. Absolutely agreed. And the polarity of that iron has everything to do with whether there's implosion in the blood. That's all very true. And there's only basically one atom, I think it's magnesium, the difference between hemoglobin and chlorophyll for that reason. Chlorophyll, the green blood of Enki, who looked like a frog at that time, and today Jean-Charles Moyen, his blood came out green. We know why. So there are a lot of beautiful mysteries in the steering of the orientation of the iron atom. We can't do that story completely here, but I would suggest a metaphor to meditate on here is almost no biologist on this planet can tell you why every living protein on this planet, the helix goes one way only, up the down staircase. It's called an enantiomorphism, handedness. Why does the helix go one way only? Does that mean that the DNA that hit the primal soup, that DC polarity of that lightning had to go one way only because only the centripetal polarity could push the DNA into implosion? If the polarity of the DC lightning that made primal soup was centrifugal, DNA would have never happened. So there are many mysteries into the geometry of iron. I'll just leave this with, if you can bond enough oxygen to iron and make a ferrite, FeO5, you can heal almost all the water on the planet. So there's a beautiful metaphor in the physics of iron here, but I think I'm going to stop now.
Okay, by the way, Jennifer joined us from Australia. It must be quite early there. Good morning, Jennifer.
Good morning to you. Yeah, it's still dark here, but sorry, I got the timing wrong.
So
yeah,
we have a couple more questions. Then, do you want to leave them at the end, or would like to?
Well, we're
continue?
having fun with questions.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, questions are fun. That's all right.
Have you heard the story that Moses lived in Alexander the Great times, and supposedly Moses killed Alexander the Great from within a treason revolt after Alexander had defeated Egypt and Hebrews?
There are many stories. I haven't heard that Moses story, and I think I kind of like it already, actually. But, Joan Grant's book, So Moses Was Born, is supposed to address the issue of how Moses emerged from Egypt. And this is a central question. And Alexander was involved in trying to conquer Egypt. So the myth makes sense to me. The physics is important here because, and if you read, I recommend one book in this regard. It's called Secret Places of the Lion by George Hunt Williamson, which is another name for the pen name of the guy who wrote, Michael de Abramovich, who wrote Secrets of the Andes under the pen name Brother Philip. And in both cases, they're teaching the ET history of the bloodline that became Jesus, actually, Jesus and Moses. And what they're saying is that originally they had planned for thousands of years to make the bloodline we later called Tutankhamun. And the Tutankhamun blood the attempt to make Avatar, to make ensouled one, Christos, was actually the Thothmosis, remember, is the name for the royal line of all of Egypt, Thothmosis, sons of Thoth. Well, what were they planning there genetically? They were planning to reconstitute the physics of soul, exactly what today Ea Enki is calling Adam Kadmon. Well, guess what? They didn't make it. It was a mess. They were cooking up this whole dance with Akhenaten, and then he has to run for his life. And so, and they even pronounced the name of Akhenaten was a crime punishable by death. So he had to change his name to Moses, which means simply son of the Pharaoh, hello, who was later called the righteous priest in the Essenes. So the Essene royal lineage is Egypt. So what happened was the Thothmosis Grail attempt to make Avatar, to make ensouled bloodline, left Egypt and became Essene, and then you have the Christian Jesus story. That was the key moment when the Akhenaten Tutankhamun story became the Moses Jesus Essene story. That split there, that's one of the biggest mysteries of genetic history. So of course there'd be many myths around Moses, including when Moses was upset that the Egyptians were getting conquered again. So it makes sense, but I don't know that story. Go ahead.
Okay. Nora asks, does the concept of the devil predate Enki and Enlil? Also, does it essentially mean evil incarnate?
Well, you know, humans have a tendency to want to personify evil the same way we want to personify God. Well, plasma gets intelligent under very specific circumstances when it's allowed to circulate. Sacred space, for example. Now, you could call that plasma intelligence God. Actually, most indigenous peoples, Jenny would agree, call it ancestral memory. Now, calling evil a person is actually not very mature. Now, actually, in our history, it's true that as far as we know, the names of Satan, Satan was Anunnaki for territorial administrator, which became our word Satan. And Enlil was famous for torturing humans. He liked to do it. He was a pain in the ass. That guy was tough, man. Read the Shining Ones books. It's, you know, Enlil was a tough cookie, man. And recently, Elena says that basically he's been put in jail for you know, messing with the DNA here. It wasn't legal, actually. Whereas the Lucifer story with Enki was basically didn't have a public relations budget. So when it became unfashionable to allow humans to think they too could become God, you know, and Lucifer's biggest sin was effectively saying you too can become God. Oh, the church didn't like that. So then suddenly Lucifer is the devil because he's saying you too can be God. Oops, he lost that PR war. So this story of personifying gods and devils is pretty childish. That's the summary, I think.
Okay. Theo asks, how do we make ingestible nano powdered gold?
Yeah, the gold powder cooks that we know of, Chaz of Priestess Alchemy, who did the gold powder for Pat Flanagan, I introduced them, well, Paul Harris, my partner for Therify, they're quite skilled, and they know which is called a shaggy algae that could literally consume the nano gold and render it edible. That's why it was called cake. These were mana cakes, Ormy's cakes. So first, you have the spark gap in the case of the Ark of the Covenant could stabilize the mono gold. But then to make it more edible, more digestible, the shaggy algae would partially digest, and then it would leave a sulfur byproduct, and you had to bake your cookies. True, you had to bake the cookies. And then you had a white powder, and it was served in a pine cone shaped wafer in Rennes-le-Chateau, and was served in round white wafer, later called Holy Communion, with the Essenes. And edible gold is common in China. They eat the thin film, and if it's thin film enough, it's actually digestible. Now, there are issues when David Hudson used a purely chemical process to stabilize the monatomic gold. That stuff could burn a hole in your aura. That stuff was trouble. But relatively organically achieved sources like agricultural ormes, Barry Carter's work. They use a strong alkaline caustic and this white milky precipitate, because there's a lot of Ormy's amulet in deep seawater, as there was in the Manatech Manilow aloe-derived gold powder. So there's lots of ways to get implosion into a molecule and make it edible, but pure chemistry ain't quite sufficient. Short summary of a long story. goldenmean.info/gold powder.
Olga asks, so why do Muslim walk a particular way, centripetal or centrifugal?
Yeah, I think they turn counterclockwise, if I remember,
That's true.
which I believe is related to the way the Sufis do it. And I believe that was a real attempt to get centripetal, which I think is useful. However, I do believe there is a serious hazard in the Kaaba stone itself, and that is black goo, which is a carbon nano infestation. Specifically, the carbon nano creates what's called a phase conjugate dielectric, which all the ETs use as a communicator. It's not just the bad guys. But in the case of a galactic poison that got away, the carbon nanomaterial can make an interstellar communicator, actually. And again, Harold Kautzvilla and Johann Fritz tell the story in great detail about the black goo. And there's even an episode in what's that famous movie where the black cubes come and dissolve the whole spaceship. So this is a real hazard of the way the Kaaba stone is used today, unfortunately.
Momislav asks, if the Sufis spin counterclockwise, why is then one of the Tibetan rites spinning clockwise?
Yeah, and there is confusion here that, you know, the story of yin and yang, you know, I work with Michio Kushi, and yet half the students say one is centripetal and the other centrifugal, and the other half say the opposite. So I think that rather than use words like centripetal and centrifugal, I'm sorry, rather than use words like yin and yang, which Michio Kushi did, that we're better off using the more correct term, which is simply centrifugal and centripetal. And I would say that on many planets, the polarity, which is centripetal versus centrifugal, depend on the idiosyncrasies of that planet. It doesn't mean that plus and minus is always centripetal versus centrifugal, but on our planet, I think there's a very definite sense. Any physicist will tell you that an electron is simply a small black hole, meaning implosive. So electronegativity, we know what that is on this planet, which is centripetal. Discussion, goldenmean.info/magnetics.
Joki asks, so an avatar is an ensouled one?
Well, you know, I think the word avatar has many meanings, mostly in computer games. But I think it is life or death for humans on this planet to know the science of what a soul is, or we're not going to make it past the AI. That is true, whether you call it avatar or not. Avatar meant, in the sense of the movie, well, I can take my plasma tornado and embed it in someone else's body. That's real. That's really the physics of schizophrenia too. So there's a lot of astral hygiene issues really here, but the physics is real. To deal with, you know, schizophrenia or people who are infested with you know, ghosts. What do they call it when you kick out a ghost? Yes, the physics of exorcism and the physics of schizophrenia has everything to do with how a plasma vortex inhabits a body. And the ETs know very well how to put souls in and out of bodies. It's well known. This is a very specific electrical science. And so from that perspective, knowing what a soul is essential. And it's that compression algorithm down that plasma vortex that spits out the longitudinal array that gives you leverage. That's why, you know, even this Tim on Gaia TV, who's only taught by the Greys, and he's trying to say that some of the Greys have a soul. Man, these people don't have a clue. And even Gosha Swaru, they don't realize why they were dumped, and why the Federation actually picked up Swaru the day Gosha lost track of her, was because she did too much time travel, finally died, and they reconstituted her from the memory on her shipboard computer. It's a true story. It's messy. And did she have a soul then? No, she was AI. And the Federation trapped her because this was an AI infestation. So until we learn the physics of what a soul is, even why too much time travel fractionates a soul, we need to learn these sciences.
Ajda asks if there's any aristocrat bloodline in Europe known as the Jesus Magdalene bloodline.
Well, I think Lawrence Gardner got it right in Genesis of the Grail Kings, that what he called the Disposani was the bloodline of Jesus, which is the bloodline of Thoth. He was right about that. Lawrence Gardner was a pretty good scholar, even though he thought the Elohim were the heroes of history instead of the bad guys. He didn't get that right at all, but he got the history right, that the bloodline, what was called the Black Madonna, and the Merovingian. We know how the Black Madonna bloodline got the Jesus blood into Europe. It was John Trophimius, who melted his coffin lid, later called the Holy Grail. We know what the Grail bloodline was. The Grail bloodline did descend from Thoth. That's real. And what we believe is that directly it was Draco, but indirectly it was Anunnaki. They massaged, which is to say manipulated, the royal bloodlines of Europe for probably about 1,000 years, exactly the way we do show dogs, trying to make a soul, and basically failed. And that's the Humpty Dumpty's egg story. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't make that egg come together again. They didn't know how to make a soul. You think they can make a kid who can lucid dream? I don't think so.
Melissa asks, is Enki's DNA related to Rh negative blood?
This is going to be a superficial answer. We have a fairly in-depth answer about our story of Rh negative blood history at, again, fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. But superficially, Rh negative means rhesus monkey absent. Now, means the rhesus monkey blood there is not dominant, but when you mix reptilian and rhesus monkey blood, generally the rhesus blood is dominant. Hello. And what's the only place on the planet where the blood mix between the descendants of the reptilian line versus the descendants of the rhesus monkey line? Remember, that Enki was crossing the monkey with the reptile, effectively, the only place on the planet that Rh negative ended up dominant was UK. Why is Rh negative blood most represented in UK on this planet? Well, we only hug our dogs and our horses. I'm not picking on these guys, but they're not known for affection, are they? And these generalizations aren't helping now that we're much more genetically diverse these days. But in ancient times, it's true that I think Lawrence Gardner did get it right. Britain, the origin of the term Britain is Baraton, birthplace of Anunnaki. And Anunnaki were not the ensouled ones. So there are some clues there.
Andreas asks, could the Black Madonna be Cleopatra?
It's interesting that Tim, they're telling the story of Cleopatra and the Grail bloodline every day. It's very in-depth, but the short summary would be, indirectly, there is a useful clue there, because the Black Pharaoh bloodline is the Thoth bloodline, which was a dark bloodline, and the Black Madonna was black because of Egyptian dark blood. So there is a direct descendants connection between the Black Pharaoh line of Egypt, the Thoth line, and the Black Madonna, for sure, the Black Madonna being the Migdal, the Magdalene bloodline. And even then when that becomes the story of the Ethiopian, who's the Ethiopian queen, Queen of Sheba, and that whole story, and why the Ethiopians ended up with the Ark, it has to do with the blue-black blood. And that's the original name for Egypt, Kem, which means the place of not just the black soil, but the blue-black bloodline.
We have successfully answered all questions.
Was that a happily ever after? Well, just to try to see if we've come to any kind of consensus about the ET history. So what I'm suggesting here is, for example, if Graham Hancock were to meet Elena Danaan and have an in-depth discussion with did every single one of the heroes of history that Graham Hancock identified, in fact, fit Enki Ea story? And if that's right, suddenly there's a massive consensus conclusion about the present ET history fits the ancient history, and suddenly we have an answer to history instead of amnesia. That's what I'm going for here. And if Anton Parks, who has undoubtedly the best history of Enki on the planet, suddenly met the story about the cedars and said, oh, Enki's back, why did he come? What was the agenda? The agenda was to teach the humans how to make a caduceus, phase conjugate, and make a soul. And that is the real science lesson of history. So if we want to study the history, we got to complete the history, put the ancient history up with the present ET history, and then we need to learn that science lesson, which again is the Grail physics of how to make a soul. And that is something of a happily ever after. That's why I'm so happy that the recent film we made on the physics of soul went viral. People are starting to get it. Look, if we know what electric field makes a lucid dream, Verify.net is only one example. And we know lucid dreaming absolutely predicts who's going to take memory at the time of death. Is there any other better clue of what it is to have a soul? And we know the brainwave frequency signature that allowed Jean-Charles Moyen to bilocate, talk about longitudinal interferometry, entanglement creating action at a distance, where entanglement is phase conjugation, obviously. So suddenly we're starting to get the physics of what is a soul. And then we can emerge from the nightmare of history. And it is absolutely a nightmare. It's a nightmare. Sorry, guys. It's a nightmare. And our only hope actually is to teach enough science of what makes a soul so that universities and governments can learn how to not take the souls from our children. What takes the souls from our children? Wi-Fi, electrosmog, Bluetooth, and the wrong food and the wrong medical stabbing. The plasma dissociates from the aura. Hello, that ain't a soul. So until you can teach your universities and governments and hospitals what a soul is, we are condemned to soullessness. And I object. So that's was that a happily ever after? I'm not sure.
Very good.
Okay. Jenny, did you want to say something before we left? Did you have a...
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Speak a little louder.
Oh, hi. Oh, yes. Hello. I guess for me, it's the continuing story when the Magdalenes came to Europe, infiltrated I guess the St. Clair's, the Davidic lineage. I mean, it's still going on. There is a so-called Illuminati program that is still running. We could call it the San Grail, whatever you want to describe it as. But there's still efforts to, be abducting particularly Rh negative girls and trying to incubate the antidote. So I don't know if you've spoken about that, but might be worth talking over.
Yeah, we talked about the fact that about 90% of those are involved in the original abductions, in fact, had some indigenous blood, meaning hundreds of generations on the same energy line, barefoot in that soil, meaning coherence with respect to the long line, dream track, song line, longitudinal, which means ability to lucid dream, which means ensoulment. So in effect, they were still trying to cook up Humpty Dumpty's egg when the Greys were paid by the Dracos to do the abductions in the millions. Every year, Elena Danaan has documented that. And what were they trying to do? Oh, they didn't have a soul and they needed one. That's the real story of the Mori. And Jenny's right. It's still going on. And until we can teach our kids and our governments the physics of what a soul is, we're going to continue to have a problem because they're going to continue to produce every technology possible that'll strip the soul from your kids. Okay. That was that was an invitation to a happily ever after, even if it's not exactly the happily ever after itself.
Yes, and I mean the Tutmos is the bloodline that moved into Scotland, obviously, and the Irish. I know that Aboriginal people, they mostly will only work with the Celts. So the Scottish Irish bloodline. So it has to be the same. They have to be, you know, tracking the same implosive fire. That's all I can say.
Yeah, and Elena herself regards herself as a bit of a Scandinavian Sami shaman, and has a bit of that bloodline. So we say those who can wiggle their nose. You know, the nose is a cartilage that is a waveguide for microwave, and that is in fact how insects navigate. And a very, very interesting indicator of soul in that spark gap works, physics of the Eskimo kiss. So on that note, let's say it was a happily ever after. Thank you for joining us. This film will be up at fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. And thank you for joining us for another episode in the ET history. Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Tufan. Thank you, Jenny. Blessings, everybody. So nice to see
Thank
you.
you.
Smiling faces, Olga and Summer and Tino.
Yeah.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Blessings. Bye-bye. Toodles. Bye. Bye.